This is part 3 of the series of videos on the racial origins of Indians and explains how the pagans Cush, Nimrod, Semiramis, and Asher corrupted Noah's true religion. Hello, friends, this is Unmasked Truth with Harmanjeet Saini, where I provide unique analysis of world events based on the unmasked truth that after surrender, Germany continued World War II clandestinely and became a killing machine. I also provide true news that you will find nowhere else. Before we discuss the racial origins of various Indians and under what ancestral names they are mentioned in the Bible, and what forced various peoples to migrate away from Babylon, we must first understand what strategies were used to corrupt Noah's true religion. God's intervention at Babel in confusing the language of mankind and destroying the tower had thwarted the rebels' project. But the leaders Cush, Nimrod, Semiramis, and Asher began to pick up the pieces of the empire they were building. Some people no longer had a heart in the project as they could not understand the leaders in many other languages because they all had a different language now. But Cush, Nimrod then began to use force to keep the people together. To accommodate people of different languages, Nimrod was forced to build different cities. The Bible says in Genesis 10 verses 10 to 12, and the beginning of his, that is Nimrod's kingdom, was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Asher and builded Nineveh and the city Rehoboth and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, the same is a great city. Cush, Nimrod, Asher were working together. As Nimrod built different cities to accommodate people of different languages, Asher separated with his descendants to build cities of his own, but they still continued to work together to build and expand their empire. For the purpose of efficiency in building agricultural and other collaborative projects, Cush assigned duties to different peoples. This division of labor was enforced and became rigid in structure. Most people resented this rigid assignment of duties, but Cush's descendants accepted it more readily than others. This is one of the clues to the origins of a part of the Indian people. The rigid assignment of tasks later developed into the caste system in India and to some extent in Egypt. Besides rigid assignment of duties, Cush and Nimrod were also forcing interracial marriages. That was the very purpose they had rebelled against Noah and God's colonization plan. Those who refused were punished with imprisonment. Because of these excesses, the descendants of Japheth banded together and forced Cush out of Babylon in approximately 2177 BCE. He left for Egypt with his descendants with curly hair, who received the same language as his and eventually settled in Ethiopia, which is named after him. Apparently, Semiramis went with Cush. But Nimrod continued to force interracial marriages and was a womanizer himself. He forced Magog, the son of Japheth, the ancestor of the Chinese peoples, to give him two of his granddaughters as wives, actually mistresses. But later, when Magog refused further interracial marriages and wanted to separate and settle his descendants away from Babylon, as Asher had done, he was imprisoned after being deposed as ruler over his own descendants. In addition, Nimrod had introduced live and human and infant sacrifices in his worship system. Eventually, the descendants of Japheth reacted to these continued atrocities of Nimrod, banded together, and forced him also out of Babylon around 2149 BCE. He went to Egypt and Ethiopia and joined his father Cush and mother Semiramis. Within 2 years, the Medes, the descendants of Japheth's son Medai, seized rulership of Babylon. They preempted Asher and his descendants, who too wanted to control the empire Nimrod had built in and around Babylon. In Egypt, Nimrod and Semiramis began to further develop their religion and propagate it. Within 2 years of Nimrod arriving in Egypt, Cush is never heard of again. He was apparently disposed of by Semiramis and Nimrod, with Nimrod blaming his father for being the cause of their loss of the empire in Babylon. In Egypt, Nimrod was among his own people. His grandfather Ham and grandmother Niama were settled nearby in the Sudan. All Africans were Ham's descendants. He was also accepted as ruler by the Canaanites, who were also descendants of Ham. Cush's descendants with the straight hair, who eventually settled in India but at this time still lived near Babylon, also accepted Nimrod as ruler over them. He planned to eventually capture and bring Babylon back into his fold as well. Now, after consolidating his rule over all these peoples, Nimrod was planning to extend his rule into Europe next. For this purpose, he had begun making allies in Italy among some influential people who had been planted as colonists by Noah and Shem. They agreed to help him conquer and rule Europe. After conquering Europe, he then planned to deal with those in Mesopotamia who had deprived him of his empire. But the tales of his religion, activities, and plans for Europe probably reached the ears of Noah and Shem, particularly his human and child sacrifices. God may have informed Noah at this stage that Nimrod should be executed for his many crimes, the very first execution ordered in the history of mankind. Noah conveyed God's decision to Shem, who immediately started making plans to carry out God's decision. Many people in Egypt probably favored Nimrod, but not all. Shem came to Egypt and, being a very eloquent man, convinced a group of 72 powerful and influential Egyptians to assist him in the execution of the wicked ruler Nimrod. They were convinced of the evil in Nimrod's deeds and the live infant sacrifices he demanded in his worship system. But Nimrod's loyal followers and spies immediately sent him word of Shem's plans. He wasted no time. Ancient traditions indicate that Nimrod gathered his forces and attacked the forces of Shem and his Egyptian allies. Though the numbers favored Nimrod, Shem's smaller forces defeated Nimrod's forces. When Nimrod saw his forces defeated, he fled for his life and went into hiding in the area that grew into Rome in Italy. This is strong evidence that Nimrod already had some powerful allies in Italy, so that he felt confident that he would find a hiding place among them. But Shem and his followers followed him there, found him, and executed him. His dead body was cut into pieces and the pieces sent to different areas, including Egypt, as a warning of what would happen to the apostates if they followed Nimrod's God-defying practices. According to ancient tradition, his death took place in the summer of around 2121 BCE, or the 17th day of the month Tammuz. Thus ended the evil career of the infamous arch-rebel Nimrod. But Semiramis was still alive. She fled Egypt for her life and went to Assyria and Babylon. She would spend her next 30 years there. Her son Horus, the Babylonian Gilgamesh, and the Assyrian Zamzinius was born there in an illegal relationship with Ninus II, the son of Asher. Slaying of Nimrod made a very powerful impression on the pagans who were following the religion of Nimrod and Semiramis. It left absolutely no doubt in their minds that those who worshipped idols, the pagan Sun-Serpent God, would be executed. If a man like Nimrod, the most powerful man in the world, of whom all the rebels were afraid of, could be slain and disposed of in such an ignominious manner, the same fate would await them. But Semiramis knew that part of the hold Cush and Nimrod had over the people was based on the religion and worship system they had developed. To maintain her hold and rule over Nimrod's empire, she had to continue propagating it. The people also desired to worship idols and continue their religious practices, but now they were afraid to do it openly. The only way for them to continue doing so would be for someone to initiate a system whereby the forbidden things were represented by some other things, such as different symbols. Such a system was developed in which Semiramis was symbolized by a tree and Nimrod was symbolized by a bull. Since Semiramis was Nimrod's mother, she could also be symbolized by a cow. These symbols then began to be worshipped, and the system became known as the Babylonian mysteries, because it was later fully developed and propagated from Babylon. The system was called mysteries because only those initiated into them would know in reality that they were worshipping the forbidden sun, fire, Satan, Nimrod, or Semiramis when they worshipped these new symbols such as a tree, bull, cow, or snake. But those uninitiated would not know. It would be a mystery to them. Now, Asher's descendant Semiramis and the Babylonians then developed a scheme to win the most educated descendants of Shem to their side. Shem was Noah's most obedient son. He had obeyed Noah and had married a white woman, thus preserving racial purity since the days of Adam and Eve. Shem had 5 sons. The eldest two, Elam and Asher, who probably were twins, had married wives from among the white daughters of Ham and Japheth respectively. But Arphaxad married a white woman. Noah worked with Arphaxad and his descendants and taught them priestly duties, which necessarily included thorough knowledge of astronomy to know the proper days and months to worship God and keep his 7 annual holy days. Descendants of Arphaxad were the only ones thoroughly knowledgeable in astronomy. Descendants of Cain had no knowledge of astronomy. Knowledge of astronomy also meant that they would be most advanced in mathematics. In addition, they maintained different written records passed on by Noah and Shem, which means that they were also the most literate people. The descendants of Ham and Japheth were not devoid of scientific knowledge. Noah had taught the scientific knowledge he had to all his descendants. In addition, the rebels had the benefit of the scientific knowledge that Neama passed on to them. Cush and Nimrod had applied that knowledge in smelting ores to produce metals and alloys and in their building projects, which all the rebels learned from them. Knowledge of astronomy and mathematics was valuable for all. In addition, the descendants of Arphaxad were being trained by Noah to be priests or teachers of God's way of life to the rest of the human family. It would be an incredible prize for the rebels if they could win them over to their side and use them to propagate their own religion around the world instead of Noah's religion. Before the flood, material progress in Lamech's family had corrupted even the descendants of Seth, who had been preachers of righteousness and God's way of life. The rebels decided to use the same tactic to corrupt the descendants of Arphaxad. They simply invited them with the incentive of profit and riches to become priests of their religion. Diodorus of Sicily, in his historical library, explains what Semiramis did in Egypt in his book 1, chapter 2, pages 27 to 29. After his, that means Osiris or Nimrod's death, Isis, which is another name for Semiramis, Egyptian name for Semiramis, and Mercury, name for Asher, celebrated his funeral with sacrifices and other divine honors as to one of the gods, and instituted many sacred rites and mystical ceremonies in memory of the mighty works wrought by this hero, now deified. Anciently, the Egyptian priests kept the manner of the death of Osiris, that he was slain and his body cut into pieces and sent to different areas of human population at that time. They kept it secret in their own registers among themselves. But in after times it fell out that some of that could not hold, some of them could not hold it in, but blurted it out so that it came abroad. She, that is Semiramis, found all the pieces of his body, save his privy members, and having a desire to conceal her husband, so Nimrod was her son and also her husband. They were so evil that she married her own son. So, and having a desire to conceal her husband's burial, yet to have him honored as a god by all the Egyptians, she thus contrived it. She closed all the pieces together, cementing them with wax and aromatic spices, and so brought it to the shape of a man of the bigness of Osiris. Then she sent for the priests to her, one by one, and swore them all that they should not discover what she should then entrust them with. Then she told them privately that they only should have the burial of the king's body, and recounting the many good works he had done, charged them to bury the body in a proper place among themselves, and to pay unto him all divine honor as to a god, that they should dedicate to him one of the beasts, a bull, bred among them, which of them they pleased, and that while it was alive they should pay it the same veneration as they did before to Osiris himself, and when it was dead, that they should worship it with the same adoration and worship given to Osiris. So, those are the origins of bull worship and the deification of Osiris or Nimrod. But being willing to encourage the priests to these divine offices by profit and advantage, she gave them the third part of the country for the maintenance of the service of the gods and their attendance at altars. So, profit was the motive for the willingness of the priests to go along with her mystery worship system, recording of perverted history, and all else she required them to do. Ownership of one third of the land for a small portion of a small population, and no taxes or tribute being imposed on them, was an enormous incentive by any standard. And they would also receive the religious offerings of the people, and even require specific offerings from the people that they could devise for their own profit in the guise of pleasing the gods. So, the continuing, in memory therefore of Osiris's good deeds, being incited thereunto by the commands of the queen, and in expectation of their own profit and advantage, the priests exactly performed everything that Isis enjoined them. And therefore every order of the priests at this day are of opinion that the Osiris is buried among them, and they have those beasts in great veneration that was so long since thus consecrated, and renew their mournings for Osiris over the graves of those beasts. There are two sacred bulls especially, the one called Apis and the other Manavis, that are consecrated to Osiris and reputed as gods generally by all the Egyptians. Since the bulls are venerated as gods, that is why they are worshipped. For this creature of all others was extraordinarily serviceable to the first inventors of husbandry, both as to the sowing of corn and other advantages concerning tillage, of which all reap the benefit. So, several things are noticeable about what the priests were willing to do. They were willing to keep secret the way Nimrod died and maintain lies instead at the urging of Semiramis. They were willing to honor bulls, knowing that in doing so they were actually honoring Nimrod. They could tell people the lie that they were worshipping bulls because of their usefulness to man. They were willing to record a perverted, paganized version of history and the religion that has come down to us as myths. They were also being offered incredible financial rewards for maintaining and propagating Semiramis's false pagan religion and worship system. At that early time in human history after the flood, when the world population was growing but was only about 100,000 to 250,000, even though humanity had become divided due to confusion of languages, most of the population had not gone far from Armenia, where Noah had been located and had sent out colonies, or the land of Shinar or Babylon, from where the rebels operated. Noah had sent out colonies to lands of the Mediterranean coast, Egypt and Libya in Africa, Italy, Spain, and Greece in Europe. Others who were sent out towards the northeast, that is Magog and his descendants, had not moved far away yet. The descendants of the rebels were all still living close to Babylon. To propagate the rebels' religion throughout the world, therefore, all that the Assyrians, Babylonians had to do was plant the descendants of Arphaxad as priests in all areas among different peoples, with incredible incentives of land, freedom from tribute or taxes, and the offerings of the people. They were brought to Egypt as priests and were already working with the Semiramis, as Diodorus describes. Paganism could thus cover all the descendants of Ham in Africa. They were planted in Babylon. Their descendants later came to be known as Chaldeans and actually built the Babylonian Empire later. King Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldean. In Babylon, they literally became priests to the tribes that migrated east into Asia. Later, Horus, the son of Semiramis, with Ninus II of Syria, took a colony of them from Babylon into Europe after they had learnt the Babylonian mystery religion. They later settled in Italy, where Noah lived out his last days, and propagated Semiramis's Babylonian mystery religion from there, that is in Italy, in Europe. These white descendants of Arphaxad functioned as priests among various peoples they settled with. When Joseph married Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On in Egypt, he was not marrying a dark descendant of Ham, but a white descendant of Arphaxad. Later, these priests interracially married with the Egyptians. Those in Italy and Europe married with mixed with the Europeans. In India, the priests are known as Brahmins. They are also descendants of Arphaxad, but were forced to racially mix with the dark Indians, for whom they have performed priestly duties in the Hindu religion over the past 4,000 years. That is why Brahmins live among all people of different languages in India. Semiramis spent approximately 98 years of her life in Babylon, 29 years of which overlapped her stay in Assyria, 110 years in Egypt, and 42 years as ruler over Assyria, with 29 years overlapping her stay in Babylon. She taught her Babylonian mystery religion to all the priests in Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. She was in an ideal position to do so. She had mastered the languages of all these peoples. Being a daughter of Ashkenaz, the grandson of Japheth, her language was probably the Babylonian language after the confusion of languages. But being the wife of Cush, she had to learn the Ethiopian language. Then she and Nimrod lived among the Egyptians. She had to master the Egyptian languages. While in hiding, she spent a considerable amount of time among the Assyrians. She had to learn their language. She would have learned some Assyrian language when Cush and Nimrod ruled in Babylon immediately after the destruction of the Tower in Babel. Thus, she could communicate effectively with all priests, the descendants of Arphaxad, among all peoples, teach them her mystery religion and her version of pre-flood history. That is why most nations, the Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, Romans, Greeks, Indians, have similar gods and goddesses, who were nothing more than deified pre-flood individuals of the families of Lamech and Cain, and deified Nimrod, Semiramis, Cush, and Asher after the flood. Though almost all descendants of Arphaxad went astray from Noah's teachings of God's way for profit, God still kept the knowledge of his ways alive through a descendant of Arphaxad. That descendant was Abraham, from whom are descended the British, American, Jewish, French, Irish, Swiss, Scandinavian, and Benelux peoples. Abraham's genealogy is mentioned in Genesis 11 verses 10 to 27 as follows through sons in each successive generation: Noah, Shem, Arphaxad, then Selah, Eber, and Peleg, and Ru, and Serug, and Nahor, and Terah, and Abraham. In part 4, I will discuss how various tribes were forced to disperse from Babylon to form various nations. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please continue to watch my videos and read my articles on important world events, World War II watch, politics, international business, advice on health and medical problems, and much more for in-depth and insightful analysis. Please also subscribe to my YouTube channel Unmasked Truth with Harmanjeet Saini to watch and get information on the latest videos.